talk about LLMs and how to kind of like think of this new paradigm and the ecosystem and what that looks like. What is this new computer? What does it look like? And what does the ecosystem look like? I was struck by this quote from Andrej actually many years ago now, I think. And I think Andrej is going to be speaking right after me. But he said at the time, AI is the new electricity. And I do think that it kind of captures something very interesting in that LLMs certainly feel like they have properties of utilities right now. So LLM labs like OpenAI, Gemini, Anthropic, et cetera, they spend CapEx to train the LLMs, and this is kind of equivalent to building out a grid. And then there's OpEx to serve that intelligence over APIs to all of us. And this is done through metered access, where we pay per million tokens or something like that. And we have a lot of demands that are very utility-like demands out of this API. We demand low latency, high uptime, consistent quality, et cetera. In electricity, you would have a transfer switch, so you can transfer your electricity source from like grid and solar or battery or generator. In LLMs, we have maybe open router and easily switch between the different types of LLMs that exist. Because the LLMs are software, they don't compete for physical space. So it's okay to have basically like 6 electricity providers, and you can switch between them, right? Because they don't compete in such a direct way. And I think what's also a little fascinating, and we saw this in the last few days actually, a lot of the LLMs went down, and people were kind of like stuck and unable to work. And I think it's kind of fascinating to me that when the state-of-the-art LLMs go down, it's actually kind of like an intelligence brownout in the world. It's kind of like when the voltage is unreliable in the grid, and the planet just gets dumber, the more reliance we have on these models, which already is like really dramatic and I think will continue to grow. But LLMs don't only have properties of utilities. I think it's also fair to say that they have some properties of fabs. And the reason for this is that the CapEx required for building LLMs is actually quite large. It's not just like building some power station or something like that, right? You're investing a huge amount of money, and I think the tech tree and for the technology is growing quite rapidly. So we're in a world where we have sort of deep tech trees, research and development, secrets that are centralizing inside the LLM labs. But I think the analogy muddies a little bit also because, as I mentioned, this is software. And software is a bit less defensible because it is so malleable. And so I think it's just an interesting kind of thing to think about potentially. There's many analogies you can make, like a 4-nanometer process node maybe is something like a cluster with certain max flops. You can think about when you're using NVIDIA GPUs and you're only doing the software and you're not doing the hardware, that's kind of like the fabless model. But if you're actually also building your own hardware and you're training on TPUs if you're Google, that's kind of like the Intel model where you own your fab. So I think there's some analogies here that make sense. But actually, I think the analogy that makes the most sense, perhaps, is that in my mind, LLMs have very strong kind of analogies to operating systems. In that this is not just electricity or water. It's not something that comes out of the tap as a commodity. These are now increasingly complex software ecosystems, right? So they're not just like simple commodities like electricity. And it's kind of interesting to me that the ecosystem is shaping in a very similar kind of way where you have a few closed source providers like Windows or Mac OS, and then you have an open source alternative like Linux. And I think for LLMs as well, we have a kind of a few competing closed source providers, and then maybe the Llama ecosystem is currently like maybe a close approximation to something that may grow into something like Linux. Again, I think it's still very early because these are just simple LLMs, but we're starting to see that these are going to get a lot more complicated. It's not just about the LLM itself, it's about all the tool use and the multimodalities and how all of that works. And so when I sort of had this realization a while back, I tried to sketch it out, and it kind of seemed to me like LLMs are kind of like a new operating system, right? So the LLM is a new kind of a computer. It's kind of like the CPU equivalent. The context windows are kind of like the memory. And then the LLM is orchestrating memory and compute for problem solving using all of these capabilities here. And so definitely, if you look at it, it looks very much like operating system from that perspective. A few more analogies. For example, if you want to download an app, say I go to VS Code and I go to download, you can download VS Code and you can run it on Windows, Linux, or Mac in the same way as you can take an LLM app like Cursor and you can run it on GPT or Claude or Gemini series, right? It's just a drop down. So it's kind of like similar in that way as well. More analogies that I think strike me is that we're kind of like in this 19th